Somebody just said to me, nobody's going to take their seat unless you tell them to. So I said, okay, I will tell them to take their seats. And you did. I should have thought of this 15 minutes ago, because I'm sure we've run things from the kitchen. Okay. Once again, I want to thank you all, or I should say, I'm Deborah McDowell. I'm director of the Woodson Institute and chair of the program committee for this most wonderful symposium. And I can say that, not congratulating myself, I can say it's wonderful. I mean no boastfulness on my part.
I figured the only way I could do this is to just grab the, they talk about grabbing the baton. So I have grabbed. So I have grabbed the mic because I think that we should all offer a toast to Debbie McDowell, who pulled off. She did an absolutely fabulous job. I know I'm a little biased, but I thought it was really a special, special event. And it wouldn't have happened without her. So, Debbie, thank you.
I guess you can have the mic taken from you if somebody's going to say such a wonderful thing. But I want to send it back to the participants, to everybody who helped, most especially. I hope I have a staff on Monday morning. I hope I do, because I tell you, they have been jumping. The joint has been jumping. We've all been jumping. Everybody's been in wonderful good humor because we all know how important it is for this event. To pull off this event. So I'm grateful to the staff of the Woodson Institute. There is Debbie Best here, the redoubtable Debbie Best. Oh, Debbie. And where's Shelley? Shelley, who is born quite gamely. Everybody thinks Shelley is a woman. But Shelley, what's your wife's name? Devin. So Shelley's wife's name is Devin, and he is Shelley. So I'm sure there's a lot of gender confusion in that family. But he bears it just very easily that people think he is a woman. And Cheryl Lewis, I have no shame, whom we brought out of retirement. Cheryl, please stand up. We have never accepted that Cheryl has retired officially 2 years ago. And so we keep finding reasons to bring her back to help us out. And she tries to do it when she can, and she did it this time. I also want to acknowledge our students. Our students have just been amazing, just absolutely amazing. I was just saying, where are you, Tessara? Okay, I was just saying to somebody, if somebody calls me in a few years to say, Tessara Knock is Secretary General of the UN, I would say, oh, I'm not surprised. And Zaria Ashby, where are you, Zaria? I get your name. There's Zara and Zaria. So is Zaria here? Zaria, thank you. Am I missing anybody? Again, Mia Logan. Mia Logan. Where are you, Mia? Mia is our former student. I'm going to be quick about this, but when you're from Alabama, you tell stories. So the script for last night's extravaganza was written, but of course I know nothing about dramaturgy. And I'm thinking, well, I'll just get somebody in the theater department to do that part. The script is done. Well, didn't quite work this way. Well, I walk out and I see Mia on the sidewalk, literally in front of my Minor Hall. I said, oh, Mia, I knew she had moved away. I said, Mia, you're visiting? She says, no, I moved back. I said, come in here. Come in here. And then the rest was it. And from that moment, I didn't have to think about anything. So what you saw last night in terms of the logistics, the flow, the organization, that's all Mia. And then, of course, all our wonderful students. Luke, where are you, Luke? Luke Williams. Luke took my class 2 years ago, and I kidnapped him after that. So Luke is in our archival project, and then when we needed someone to be in the extravaganza, you know, you can do double duty. Lundega, same here. Lundega's in the archival project, but she was one of the actors. Am I missing anybody? Edward, where are you, Edward? Edward may have had another mission tonight. Okay. Anyway, the problem with trying to thank people by name is you inevitably miss someone, and it's just because you're middle-aged and forgetful. Now, have I forgotten someone on our side? James Perla. Oh my goodness. Now this is really, James, where are you, James? Now this is really bad because James Perla was on his way out of the door, having finished his tenure with us. I said, James, I did a James Brown on him. Please, 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 please. And he stayed. James has stayed with us through the symposium. I am truly, truly grateful. Let me quickly get through this. The Freedom Singers, Rutha, Charles, Emery, the jazz band is preparing for their own concert on Sunday, so they couldn't be here. Maida, where are you, Maida? Maida, I first heard when the university was reinterring the remains of formerly enslaved people at the university graveyard. And it was a ceremony that occurred in the evening, and I can still see, I don't have hair on my arms, but if I did, they would be raised up, the hairs would be raised up. Maida just gave an amazing performance. So in thinking about last night, the concept for last night, I said, I gotta find who that woman was, who was at the graveyard. And we found her, and from the moment we found her, she says, yes, baby. So she came, and I think I've covered everybody. I think I have. So that's it. I'm going to ask my esteemed colleague, Maurice Wallace. Wait a minute, hold on, wait a minute. Do you want us to begin the keynote now? I've forgotten the order. The staff of the Omni said, we're gonna do this, and then the speaker's gonna speak, but I've forgotten. So, are we ready for the speaker? No? Okay. I think we're gonna eat the first course. Now it's coming back to me. I've slept very little in the last days, so just be patient with me. So we're gonna eat the salad course, I now remember. And then Maurice will introduce Ben Jealous. Welcome, thank you, bless you.
Good evening, everyone. It is my It is my privilege to introduce tonight's keynote speaker for this wonderful event. Not long ago, named by the Washington Post one of the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders, Ben Jealous is civil rights leader, author, and in decidedly postmodern parlance, not at all imprecise, social impact investor. Inasmuch as we have come to know Mr. Jealous by name these last 10 years at least, it is likely owing to his historic appointment as president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In 2008, Mr. Jealous, at 43, became the youngest leader of this revered vanguard civil rights organization, today more than a century old. A native of the state of California with deep attachments to Baltimore, Maryland, and as a native Marylander myself, I aim to ask him if those attachments are deep enough to appreciate hard-shell crabs and Old Bay seasoning. Mr. Jealous holds degrees from Columbia University and University of Oxford, United Kingdom, where he enjoyed that none too common honor of being a Rhodes Scholar. Not impressed yet? Then let me add that Mr. Jealous has been named to an enviable number of distinguished leaders lists, including those of Forbes magazine, Time magazine, and TheRoot.com, all extolling his youth, his vision, organizational acumen, and power of advocacy. In 2012, Mr. Jealous was awarded the Puffin Nation Prize for Creative Citizenship by the Puffin Foundation and the Nation Institute, an award given annually to an individual who has been exceptional in challenging the American status quo through distinctive, courageous, imaginative, and socially responsible work of significance. Not long after the Puffin Nation Prize, just a few short months in fact, the Davos World Economic Forum conferred on Mr. Jealous the title Young Global Leader in recognition of his work on behalf of the NAACP and in the spirit of the World Economic Forum's objective to improve the state of the world by engaging business, political, academic, and other public leaders in shaping vital global, regional, and industry agendas. Elevating as these several awards are, however, to the profile of this extraordinary servant leader, the measure of this man rests not with his laurels, but with his labor. Far from living and working beholden to the elite and their interests, an irrepressible drive toward justice and struggle would seem to inspire Mr. Jealous's public, civic, and social commitments, not the least of which have involved, over his remarkable and still yet young career, voter rights and registration, marriage equality advocacy, death penalty abolition, environmental justice, vigorous opposition to racial profiling practices, and what he calls justice tech, that is, orienting the tech world towards social justice imperatives. If this work is not enough, last year with Trabian Shorters, Mr. Jealous co-edited a handsome volume titled Reach, 40 Black Men Speak on Living, Leading, and Succeeding, a book of personal essays featuring 40 first-person narratives by Black artists, community organizers, entrepreneurs, religious leaders, philanthropists, and educators, including contributors as recognizable as John Legend, Reverend Al Sharpton, Bill T. Jones, Talib Kweli, Isaiah Thomas, and Louis Gossett Jr. The word indefatigable, I am coming to believe, was invented for figures like Ben Jealous. Correction, for figures like Ben Jealous and Julian Bond. In 2009, Jealous and Bond, then president and chairperson respectively of the NAACP, cooperated on a short article for the New Republic titled Disputations, Is the NAACP's Relevance Fading? Directly disputing John McWhorter and anyone else's naive post-racial suggestion that the NAACP may be or become in short order anachronistic. After all, we have a black president, that inane logic goes. They wrote, quote, "The NAACP is the triage room for communities in crisis, whether it's helping to unionize 5,000 workers at the world's largest pork processing plant in North Carolina, offering Muslim prisoners who, because of recent legal action by the NAACP in Oregon, have the right to wear Muslim clothing and have their religion respected, registering hundreds of mostly white prisoners in Maine to vote, fighting school closings in low-income neighborhoods in Seattle, or suing the Department of Housing and Urban Development for allowing the Mississippi governor to divert money designated for Katrina victims, the NAACP is here now, as it has been for a century, to redress the injustices and right the wrongs." The article is short, admittedly, but it's long in history and conviction. One senses not exhaustion or resignation, but the bell of another round in a heavyweight bout that both know is several more rounds coming. As I said, indefatigable. Please help me then welcome tonight another race man, cut very nearly from the same cloth as the exemplary race man whose memory this symposium and this dinner honors. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, please help me welcome Mr. Ben Jealous. And crew.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, good evening. This is how you raise racemen. You just bring them with you. That was the most thorough introduction I've ever received. And humbling. I felt like I was listening to my own obituary. I was like, I can just die now. No, but thank you. It was very kind and very humbling. And it's healing to stand here in front of so many friends of Julian and in front of Pam. Julian and I were supposed to have a book coming out this fall. When he passed, he had a whole plan of traveling with Pam and baseball games and being with her family, and then we were going to come back and try to quickly put together a book on voter suppression to be out in time for this election. Julian would remind us that tonight in Indiana, there are dozens of voter registration workers still shaken from being thrown up against the wall by Governor Pence's state police as they shut down the largest voter registration operation in the state a week before the deadline and threatened them and accused them of doing something sinister simply because they were registering more black folks than anybody had registered in Indiana in a very long time. And that those workers simply are just the latest in a string of such acts of intimidation that includes Julian's home of Georgia, where the New Georgia Project has been viciously attacked by the Secretary of State and the governor there, who just recently were forced to, yes, by the courts, finally go ahead, and now they're very quickly trying to register the 50,000 registrations they were holding up. And Julian and I were both inspired in 2012 when this kind of new wave of using police to intimidate voter registration operations was rebuffed by the old ladies of the NAACP in Florida. Now, the League of Women Voters shut down their operation, Rock the Vote shut down their operation. All three organizations were confronted on the same day. It was Martin Luther King Day, 2012. A new law had gone into effect that said you could not have your voter registration form out of the county clerk's office for more than 48 hours. You had to take him out, get him filled out, bring him back within 48 hours. Well, Martin Luther King Day weekend lasts longer than 48 hours. And so the sheriffs were there waiting the Tuesday after Martin Luther King Day for all the forms to come back in. And as they came back in, they explained to people, if you do this again, if you have these forms out for any reason for more than 4 years, you will either be paying a big fine or doing a short stint in the county jail. And most folks were intimidated by that, but there were a bunch of old ladies in the NAACP in Florida who said, I'm sorry, babe, can you repeat that? So what you're saying is if I do this again, I'll either get a short stay in the county jail or a big fine or maybe both? Okay. Would you give me some more forms then? You see, those old ladies were once young women, and when they were young women and girls, they were trained by Harry and Harriet Moore. Harry and Harriet Moore, Harry, very much like Julian, was as much of a progressive as he was a black civil rights leader. He was the president of the Florida Progressive Party or Association and the president of the Florida NAACP at the same time. And he ran what, until that year, 2012, was the largest voter registration drive in Florida's history. And the Klan rewarded him for that by packing his and his wife's crawl space under their bedroom with dynamite on Christmas night and blowing them to smithereens. And that's how we begin the NAACP convention in Florida every year, is remembering Harry and Harriet Moore. And so when those young ladies turned old women and were confronted by those sheriffs, they weren't very impressed. Let's understand, what Julie and I have in common is we come from, I guess, the more forgotten tradition of civil rights leadership. We remember the preachers as preachers, and we remember the lawyers as lawyers, but the organizer, journalist, historian, Ida B. Wells, Walter White, W.B. Du Bois, we see them as individuals. We don't understand the tradition that they're a part of as well. And that's oftentimes been the more radical tradition inside of the NAACP. And Julian wore that like he wore everything else with such finesse. When I became president of the NAACP, he leaned over to me and said, brother, the one rule of leadership in this organization is ABC. I said, what's that? He said, always be cool, brother. Always be cool. And Julian literally exuded cool. My daughter, when she was a little younger, she's now 10, a little younger than my son is now, was at a Montessori school not far from American University where Julian also taught. And when one of the young teachers there, who was one of his students, found out that I was working with him, she just began gushing. He has the same pheromone as like Harry Belafonte, And, sorry to make you blush, Pam. And she just began gushing. She said, oh, Professor Bond, he is so cool. He can make tripping while walking across the street look cool. And I thought to myself, yeah, I guess he could. In fact, and Julian took pride in this. He would often tell self-effacing stories, like the one time that he gave a tour of Atlanta to Huey Newton and he bought a gun just for the occasion. And got to a certain point in the tour where he pulled, and the gun was just a .22, but it was fashioned to look like a German Luger. Because Julian's cool, right? I mean, you can't just have a simple gun. You can't have a little .22. You got to have a Luger, right? So he gets to a certain point in the tour, he pulls this Luger out of the glove box and begins pointing around the skyline of Atlanta in his convertible while Huey Newton's just ducking in the car. But it was with some pride when I asked him, I said, Julian, I said, how do you remember the March on Washington? And he said, what was the highlight for you? He said, you have to understand what my job was. I said, what was your job? He said, to pass out Coca-Cola to the real celebrities. I said, what was the highlight for you? He said, when Sammy Davis Jr. took a Coke from me, pointed at me and snapped and said, you're cool, kid. I mean, if Sammy Davis Jr. calls you cool, oh, you've got to be cool. But part of why somebody ends up in that tradition of the kind of agitator, journalist, historian in our movement is because you were both blessed and cursed to be a person of long memory from a people of long memory. And with that comes a certain cynicism, a certain urgency, and a certain optimism. And tonight I want to focus on the optimism. Coming down to Virginia for me, I got to tell you, I live right across the border, and I like it that way. My family's run away from Virginia twice. Some of them still here. My cousin Sid Dorsey's here, but most of us ran away and stayed away. And the state's full of ghosts. But the state right now really should be full of hope. And the reason why people are organizing so hard in Georgia, why we're seeing the biggest voter registration drives in Georgia that we have seen literally since Vernon Jordan was leading them, while they're organizing so hard in this state, last time around you saw in Virginia 71 out of the 100 seats in the assembly, in the House here, went uncontested. Even districts that Terry McAuliffe would win, or that Kane had won when uncontested. This year, progressives intend to contest every single one of them. And why is there such great optimism? You said journalist, agitator, right here, historian. Why is there such great optimism? Well, as progressives rooted in the South, it is easy to look at our movement, easy to look at the history of fusion politics in our states and feel like two-time losers. Because we know how Reconstruction ended and the reign of terror that followed. And we know how the New South ended and, frankly, how unsatisfying experience it was even when it was the New South. But those of us who are organizing now and paying attention to the numbers now understand that there's something different this time, which is that the numbers will soon be in our favor if they aren't already. In Georgia, conservatives, Republicans tend to win statewide elections by about 250,000 votes. There are 600,000 unregistered, more recent update, because of the New Georgia Project, there are now 450,000 unregistered black folks, so they've registered over 150,000 of them. And 230,000 unregistered Latinos and Asian Americans right now in Georgia. In other words, if you register all of them and only half of them turn out, the Republicans would never win again. In South Carolina, the margin of victory is about 100,000. There's 350,000 unregistered black folks right now. And in North Carolina, the margin of victory is typically only about 25,000. And in Virginia, it's about 75,000. And there are hundreds of thousands of people to be registered here right now. And that should give us sort of great energy. But first, we have to really internalize that our faith and the faith of our mothers and fathers has been well placed. That we actually can see happen to these states, what we saw happen a long time ago to counties throughout these states. Power just shifts suddenly in a very progressive direction. It's that tradition that Julian's leadership was a part of, that always pushed us to push hard, to be on the edge, to stand up for the rights of everybody. And let me be clear, when there were, and I don't think I've ever said this publicly before, when the three finalists for president of the NAACP, when I was ultimately chosen, were backstage, we figured out that all three of us were pro-marriage equality. Preacher from Dallas, a politician from Florida, myself, San Francisco. Maybe that one was obvious. And And then it occurred to all of us that there was only one reason why every single candidate the board had to choose from was pro-marriage equality. Why that was the case, and of course it was the chair of the selection committee who was Julian Bond. But for Julian, that was as much about dignity for a particular set of people as it was about a mindset that he wanted in the leader of the NAACP. That was the issue at the time in 2008 that defined whether you really believed in the 14th Amendment and its equal protection provision for everybody or just for yourself. And he was looking for somebody who believed in it for everybody. You see, ultimately, when you're an activist historian, you're chairman of a group like the NAACP, you remember things that most people give themselves permission to forget. Like the fact that the NAACP had changed its name. See, the NAACP was founded as the National Negro Association. Julian's family, like mine, had joined early on and been in discussions with leadership of the NAACP early on, and facts like that stick. What many fail to understand is the code in the name NAACP. You see, W.B. Du Bois himself came into a meeting of the NAACP. The organization was only about a year old, and then it was the NNA, the National Negro Association. And he said, we have to change our name. And they said, why? I mean, we're a year old, and folks are just starting to know our name. Why do we need to change our name? And W.B. Du Bois said, because it's not what we're about. National Negro Association. We're not about trying to, like, say, replace white supremacy with black supremacy. We're not even just trying to help black people. No, we're trying to end white supremacy. We're trying to end segregation. We're trying to end colonialism. We are on the side of everybody from India to Ireland. Who's fighting against this scourge, we are, at the end of the day, simply trying to lift up the 4/5 of the world that is colored to the level that the Anglo-Saxon has placed themselves on. And colored at that time, yes, included Irish Catholics. The only other group that the British press drew as monkeys and apes besides Africans. And that understanding that Du Bois had was inherited, if from anybody, from Frederick Douglass, who stood up in times very similar to our own, times when there was hysteria in the country because of an increasing black vote and its power, the early days of Reconstruction, and the increasing power of the vote of immigrants of color, in that case Chinese. And if you haven't read the speech ever, or you haven't read it recently, or you simply have not read any 19th century order in a while, I would recommend to you Frederick Douglass's speech, Our Composite Nationality. It was his tirade against the Chinese Exclusion Act, not dissimilar to these Latino Exclusion Acts we've seen from Alabama to Arizona that Julian and I both traveled to fight. And there were several things in this speech that really kind of stick with us. You know, one of them, he said, look, we didn't come through a great war to end slavery in the Southeast just to watch you enslave somebody else in the Southwest. And in that, the mission of the black civil rights community to always stand on the side of immigrants of color who are being exploited. He says in that speech, if you believe that majorities matter, and I believe they do, then it should matter that 4/5 of the world is colored people, and only 1/5 white. That line right to Du Bois renaming the organization National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The code's pretty clear. We simply want to lift the 4/5 of humanity that's been subjugated by colonialism and segregation up to the same level as everybody else. But perhaps the most enduring component of that speech that really imbues our movement with optimism to this day is he said, and of course, if I continue to paraphrase, I'll tell you when I'm quoting him because there's a lot of these and thous in 19th century orators. It's like reading the King James Bible. It doesn't lend itself well to long, direct quotes. But he says, look, every nation has a unique destiny. And its destiny is based ultimately on its character, defined by that nation at its best, not its worst. Charitable decision for a man who had been held and tortured as a slave. And ultimately, a nation's character is shaped by its geography. And our geography is unique. We are bordered by friendly nations. Lest Donald Trump confuse you. Friendly nations north and south of different races. And by great oceans, east and west, that connect us to every other country on the planet. And therefore, our destiny, as based on our character, defined as us at our best, and shaped by our unique geography, and this is the exact quote. Frederick Douglass, approximately 1868, 9, said, was to be the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever seen. Frederick Douglass at the time was the most photographed American of his age. Most photographed American of the 19th century. He was the father of black republicanism, the father of the civil rights movement, the highest ranking black in law enforcement in this country at a time. But in those words, the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family, he gave charge to the greatest tradition of the black civil rights movement, of the American civil rights movement, which is an ever-expanding definition of the circle of dignity and equality. And that's what Julian dedicated his life to. And if you understand how this work wears people down, as it forces them into early graves, and not just by bullets, but by spending too many waking hours concerned about too many other people's problems and not enough about your own health. It was to that vision that Julian gave his life. Our responsibility at this moment in history is not just to hold on to that faith and that vision that has motivated so many of our ancestors, yes, now including Julian, for so long. Our responsibility at this moment, yes, the children of two times losers, some of us live long enough to know all of it, like my grandmother who's 100 years old, whose grandfather was born a slave and died a state senator and co-founded Virginia State University. Born early enough to know that voter suppression laws were put in place to make sure that men like her grandfather would never serve their state again. And lived long enough to see those laws undone and then a new generation pass. Now, our responsibility right now is to understand what those people who are passing those laws have already figured out, which is that we, people of color and Americans of all color of good conscience, are in control not only of the future, but of how fast it comes. That we ultimately will determine whether all the unregistered voters get registered in Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, and yes, right here in the heart of the Confederacy itself, Virginia with all of its crazy monuments. And if Julian were here tonight, he would tell us not to tarry. Not for his benefit, he was long done with running for office, and not for that of any singular ambitious person, but rather because of the ambitions of generations it will unleash for generations. For us finally to get to a place where every Virginian has a voice in the politics of Virginia, where every American has a voice in the politics of America, where the dream of people like Julian and my mom and Snick and the promise of our country from the beginning, one person, one vote, will actually be realized. Let me also, just before I close tonight, just give you one observation from the field this year. You know, it's the media loves to deal in stereotypes. It turns out most reporters are not that smart. And the ones who are, I'm convinced, are just kind of tired, not really trying to figure out what's going on, got too many deadlines, got to write for online and in print. It's not the polite profession it used to be. And so they would tell you during the primary, you know, well, the black church ladies are for Hillary, and the angry white dudes are for Trump, and the other white dudes are for Bernie. And like leave out a good chunk of the country. But they keep telling us over and over. And then it occurred to me, I was like, well, my mom's a black church lady who's for Bernie. And we were at Morehouse, and there are a lot of black young people who were for him too. Then Bernie and I were standing backstage, you know, this guy who had been in CORE like my dad and led them into SNCC like my mom and been in this movement for a long time. And we had just come from the south side of Chicago, and we had landed in the Ozarks. And the crowd in the Ozarks was as white as the crowd in Chicago was black. And the crowd in the Ozarks, well, 20% of the crowd was in camouflage, as if they were coming from or going to deer hunting. Now, I don't know enough about killing deer to know which one they were doing, but they were definitely, that was happening that day too. And the applause lines were all the same as they were in Chicago, including when all of these working class white men in camouflage were on their feet cheering when Bernie called for the police to stop killing unarmed black men. And the press didn't write about it. I mean, how could they? It defied all their stereotypes, ultimately, of working class white men in the South, or wherever the heck the Ozarks are. Missouri, it's kind of confusing. Feels like the South to me. And that's what we can't afford to lose sight of. You know, I talked to Bernie about that, and he said, well, you know, that's the revolution in this revolution. You know, the other piece of optimism that ultimately sustained Julian, it sustains me, it sustains this movement, that's remembered oftentimes only by those activist historians like Taylor Branch, who's here with us tonight. Great historian of our movement, great freedom fighter with Julian, the very beginning. Is that the activist in you knows that politics shares a lot in common with physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And something in motion tends to return to its original state. And most of the folks you organize with, they're taught out of ancient black history, like, 150 years ago or something. From Roots, or Django, or 12 Years a Slave, or even the very sincere and passionate The Birth of a Nation that just came out. But the historian in you remembers, whether it's from Herbert Apteker or Howard Zinn or so many others, that the history of slavery itself was long. And it didn't begin the way it ended. That in this state, where even right now in some counties, a young black man dating a young white woman, getting her pregnant, may end up killed. That in the recordings of the churches of Virginia in the mid-1600s, the punishment for premarital sex between a black man and a white woman was the same as it was between everybody else. It was, ye both shall don white and stand in the courthouse door for the appointed number of hours or days. That at that point, we weren't known as blacks and whites. We were known by our nationalities. The race would be imposed decades later, soon after, but not at that point. And that the earliest rebellions in this state were typically indentured servants and slaves together. In fact, one of the first recorded happened in Gloucester County. And the response, I think this is prescient, the response that triggered it was the reaction of indentured servants and slaves and indentured servants to an order handed down from the king through the governor of the Commonwealth, which said, in effect, and your status shall convey to your children. And your status shall convey to your children. You see, Barack Obama, we now know, descends from a slave who was and a white woman who had a baby who was born free, because at that time, the status of the child was defined by the status of the mother. So a white woman gave birth to free black children who our president descends from on his white mother's side. But this order would be a revolution of things. The children of slaves would remain slaves. The children of indentured servants would remain servants. Would have to earn their way out when they hit majority. And they rebelled. Because the character of the people of our nation is fairly similar to this day, which is that we will endure a lot, almost anything, if we can believe our children might live a better life than the one we have known. But at the moment that it becomes clear that our children are damned either to the same fate or a worse fate, say because they're coming out of college indentured, then we rebel. If we remember the original state of race relations only as back as the late days of slavery, if we remember it only as, if you will, white overseer pitted against black slave, then we short-circuit our own sense of possibility. Because if the possibility of race relations is defined by the original state, then the original state was one of shared struggle, of people at the bottom, rebelling against those oligarchs at the top who would cast all of their children down a well. And at this moment, if you want to understand what the alternative is to the pessimism and cynicism and racism of Donald Trump, the alternative is to respond to the exact same anxieties with the sort of real plan for change that Julian Trump triumphed his entire life. Ladies and gentlemen, the days may feel dark as we get to the end of this election cycle. We have been subjected to, I think, a collectively painful experience. But understand that the numbers for the first time in our history are on our side. That whites of good conscience and people of color, of all colors, now outnumber those who would hold fast to the traditions of divide and conquer in this country, not just in the country as a whole, but in every state, at least along the eastern seaboard of the South. And so no matter what happens on election day, get up the next day committed to organize, committed to register more voters than you've ever registered, and committed to finally realizing the hope of our ancestors and proving them right, that we are indeed destined to be the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever seen. Thank you, and God bless.